Hey there, good morning. This is chapter 2, where we are going to be building the source to our digital front end. I am, of course, the one-armed audiophile, and this is a series where we build a digital front end to your hi-fi system. And in this chapter 2, we're going to be looking at our hardware options for the source, and we're going to start ordering that hardware and put it together. And so we can move along the path here and have something to serve up our digital files and control our streaming, our libraries. We'll talk all about that. If some of this isn't making much sense to you, go ahead, check out chapter 1, where we did an entire intro on what we're going to build out and what this whole series is about on chapter 1. And if you did see it and just want to support the channel, go ahead and see it again. Could use more watch hours on that one as we try and build this out. But anyways, I appreciate it, and let's get into it. Man, that's good stuff. All right. I think for this one, let's just move right into TinyPad and start diagramming what is going to happen with our source build. And I call this the heavy lift, the thing that is actually going to be managing, again, our libraries, our streaming management, any of our streaming protocols, any of our conversions. And so it starts with a box of compute. And inside our box, we've got, of course, the CPU, we've got memory, we've got disk, and we've got network. So let's talk about some requirements for each of these things. First of all, network, as we discussed, we want this to be hardwired. We're going to do our best to make sure that this is hardwired. And our requirements here are 1 gigabit, thank you, per second. And more importantly, we want this to be full duplex. Now, everything these days should be full duplex, but make sure if you have the ability, and if you don't, time to upgrade your router or switch, make sure that you can see that and make sure that it is actually full duplex. As we discussed, most of your streaming, in fact, all of your streaming, is going to come into the source and go back out. And potentially, if you're using a NAS or some type of file storage, same thing. You're going to be pulling data into the source and sending it back out to the digital transport. And we don't want any contention about that receive and transmit on the network interface. And the way we get rid of that contention is we want to make sure that that interface is running at full duplex. So we get the full gig of receive and the full gig out, and that happens independently. Old network hubs and some old network switches would run at half duplex. So if it was receiving data, it could not transmit, and if the interface was transmitting data, it could not receive. And the switch and the network card managed that, but it caused tremendous latency, retries, things would drop, and something like a real-time protocol somewhat close to audio, but certainly in voice, would completely fall apart. And in audio, with streaming, with pulling files from a server, we need to make sure that that's full duplex. All right, enough about that. Our disk, we've got 2 things we need to be aware of: our read speeds and our write speeds. So let's talk about write speeds real quick. Write speeds are not so important in this build. And the reason for that is if we think about our use case for files, we're going to be uploading probably once, right? So if we think about that we have ripped a CD or SACD, or we've recorded a record, or we've downloaded, either however we acquire our downloads, but go support an artist right now and go buy some music online and pull it down. But our files, essentially, we're going to upload those or move those, copy those to our source. We're going to do that once. And so the speed of that isn't so critical. Our write, therefore, can really be anything that's modern. Okay, it'll still function. Now, there might be a responsiveness target that you personally want to hit, where faster drives are going to make you happy because that upload is going to happen faster. But ultimately, to the performance, to our sound quality, it's not going to matter. Read. Let's talk about read for a second. Read speeds is about getting those files back off of disk and getting them moved over to our digital transport to be processed into sound. Hey there, it's Ryan on the editing floor. I forgot to mention something about write speeds. Since our source holds all of our files, some of you will manage metadata on that source as well. And these can be things like tags within individual files. And an example that I used or have used recently is, let's say that you've collected thousands upon thousands of downloads over the course of the year, and you want to go back and you want to add a tag within all of those files that says that you acquired them in 2025. So not just the timestamp on the file itself, but actually a tag within that. And most of your library management systems can use that tag to bring up that information. Additionally, there may be edits you want to do across your entire library. The important piece about that from a write perspective is that operation of making those tag changes is going to be completely dependent on your write speed, because you have to write that data into the file. So if you plan to or already do quite a bit of metadata management using tags within files, that's going to be your primary reason to bump up that write speed and get as fast a write speed as you can. All right, now back to the video. Now, in audio, we don't deal with very large files. Okay, and comparably to video or any of the other types of things that we can be managing, audio is relatively small files. If you think about an average ripped CD, which is 500 to 600 megs in FLAC, it can be 3 to 4 times that if you're ripping it to WAV, but FLAC is a compressible lossless technology, and most people, I think at this point, use one of the compressible lossless technologies. So we'll say, 500 to 600 meg is the average. That's an entire CD, and we're not dealing with entire CDs, entire albums. Even if we rip an SACD, which can be a couple gigs, or if we're downloading high resolution albums of 24,192, things like that, those can be certainly a couple gigabytes for the entirety of the album. However, we're not dealing in albums when we are sending those across our network to our digital transport. We're dealing in individual tracks. So especially at 1644 Redbook, if we've ripped a CD, those individual tracks are really small, a couple hundred or less than 100 megs if the entire disk is 500 to 600 megs. And our SACD tracks, our high resolution tracks, a little bit larger than that. And so really it's not a lot of data. And when you think about even spinning hard drive speeds, that is plenty to pull that very quickly and get it moved. Modern drives are 8 gigabits a second at the higher end. And again, we're not going to run into any bottlenecks with really almost any. I mean, you have to really try to get your disk to cause you a problem when you build the source. So we're not going to worry too much about that. Really, anything we choose is going to work for us. Now, memory. All right, memory we do need to talk about, and this is really going to help with the responsiveness of our platform. Okay, most modern managed libraries, those libraries are being managed by a database that wants to sit resident in memory. So we need a good amount of memory, and let's target anywhere from 32 to go nuts, 128 gigs of memory. And we do want a large memory system because we want it to grow. We don't want it to bottleneck. And some of the experimentation that we're going to be doing is going to require a little more memory than I think you were anticipating. But we'll get there. We'll show you memory usage and some of the things we're doing that do require a little bit larger amount of memory. Additionally, there are a couple different types of memory. Let's try that again. There we go. DDR4, DDR5, and something that you may have heard about is unified memory. So what is DDR4, DDR5? That is just an evolution of memory buses and memory systems, and it has to do with the amount of bandwidth of the memory. Essentially, bandwidth is like lanes, right? If you think of it of 2-lane road, 4-lane road, 6-lane road, the more lanes, the more data you can move, and the chunks of data that you can move. Larger chunks, we can move more data at a time, and latency. And latency is really important for responsiveness for some of the things we're going to experiment with, which we'll get into down in later chapters. So we want a good amount of memory. We want to be able to move large chunks of data very quickly, and we want that to happen at a very low latency. Just know that DDR4 to DDR5 is a big jump in performance, so we want to minimally be here with our DDR5, and we see another significant jump in performance if we can get to one of the new unified memory architectures. Now, CPU. The responsiveness and our ability to churn through data, to process data, is based upon the number of clock cycles we can get out of a CPU. And there's a little more to that than just the number of clock cycles, and we're talking really when you see 3 gigahertz, right, or 5 gigahertz. These are the speeds of the CPU, but within that you'll see single core performance and multi. And for our application, most of the software that we're going to be working with really is single core dependent, meaning that it runs on a single core. It doesn't have a lot of threads. It's not sending workers out to a bunch of different cores, so we're not getting a huge advantage out of multi-core performance. So when we look at what our options are, we want high base clocks, for single core performance, okay? So what is a high base clock? Well, we're going to target 3 gigahertz, and for bumping up to higher tasks, we're going to look for something in the range of 5 gigahertz. So we want a CPU that has base clocks above 3, and we want it to be able to boost around that 5 gigahertz or higher. And so that's most of it, but there's one more thing we need to talk about, and we already touched on it just a little bit, and that's I/O, right? So for each of these architectures in x86 and the different Intel platforms and the way Mac builds out their stuff, and if we look at the architectures of like a Raspberry Pi and the small board computer architectures, I/O becomes a very important piece because you've got CPU talking to memory, CPU talking to disk. We've got network coming in that needs to go somewhere and be processed and sent back out. And so we've got a lot going on, inter-process or inter-hardware to move data around. And so our I/O architecture becomes really important. And I'll give you a good example of really a bad I/O architecture when we go back down here to network. And that example is a Raspberry Pi 3, okay? Raspberry Pi 3, the way that they built their network interface is they stuck the network interface on the USB bus, okay? So I'm going to use this space over here to draw a little Raspberry Pi 3, right? And if you think about the network interface over here and this poor little CPU and this little chip that's trying to manage all of the USB ports off the side here, if you had something going on the USB bus, keyboard, mouse, whatever, and you were trying to also do network at speed, there was contention there. And it just couldn't handle it. And so network speeds were very slow, so very high latency. It could eventually lead to packet loss. And the best part was in audio, if you've got a DAC hanging off here and you've got network audio trying to feed into here, this is a big no. Whoa. No, we're not going to do that, right? Kick it off the screen. So we do need to be aware of our architectures and our I/O and how it works and understand all of that interprocess data and where it's moving, how it's moving. Really important. I don't think anything we're going to look at is going to be as bad as what happened with the Raspberry Pi 3. But when we get into specifics of some of the software that we're running, we will look at where the advantages are to some of these architectures. All right, so let me bring us back here. And now that we've talked through that, from that diagram, obviously the two things that we stayed on for a while was RAM. We want fast RAM, we want fast I/O architecture to it, and we want minimally 32 gigs, but as much as we can cram in the thing up to a point. I'll get to that in just a second. And then CPU, we want lots of single core performance, and we're shooting for a clock speed of 3 gig base, up to 5 gig burst speeds would be great. Now, why don't we just throw tons and tons of RAM on it? Why don't we go to the highest clock speeds we possibly can? And the reason for that is something called TDP, thermal design power. So one of the requirements for our source as we build this out is we're going to leave it on 24/7, or assume that you're going to leave it on 24/7. Again, smile factor in your digital front end is going to be you sit down with your control and you hit play and you get music. You don't want to be worried about booting up your source, especially if you have other people in the house that want to use this thing. You don't want to have to teach them where to go to turn this thing on. We don't want to worry about, is it going to boot? Is it going to have a problem because of the latest update? We just want it to hum away and be available at all times. As soon as we sit down, listen to a track. We should listen to music as often as we possibly can. Grab a track where we can. We don't want to say, I'll listen to music later because I don't want to turn that thing on. No, we don't want to do that, all right? So we also don't want to burn up a bunch of power for no reason, okay? If the thing's on 24/7, you're probably not listening to music 24/7, so there's going to be points in time where it's sitting there idle, all right? So what is TDP? Thermal design power is the number that manufacturers publish when they have a CPU that tells people who put machines together, whether that's big box store, whether that's, it's your Dells of the world, that's your Apples of the world. It is a number that is how much heat needs to be dissipated for that CPU not to overheat. And it's an average of a workload, okay? So it's not the highest or as fast as that CPU or the highest thermal displacement that's needed, and it's not the lowest, the idle displacement. It's kind of in the middle. And what we can do to figure out how much heat needs to be dissipated, this TDP number in watts can be converted to joules per second. And so if we have a CPU that's a TDP of 80, we know that we need to dissipate 80 joules a second of heat. And we do that through things like heat sinks and fans. And where does that heat go? It just goes out into the atmosphere. And so we're sucking that heat off of the CPU, putting it into the atmosphere. And as long as we can dissipate that heat as fast as the CPU can generate it, then we can run at whatever clock speed the TDP average is hitting. So really we want to make sure that whatever design we use as the source is dissipating enough heat so that we can actually utilize those boost clocks when we need to, and at minimally, right, the base clocks, so that we don't thermal throttle it down even slower. That's just going to be very wasteful to what we have purchased and bought as far as horsepower. All right. There are two architectures, CPU architectures, that we should talk about very briefly. The first being Intel, or really x86. This is the architecture that AMD uses and Intel uses. And x86 architecture has been around for half a century. It's been around for a very long time. Secondarily, there's the ARM architecture. This is what Apple and the Macs have adopted for their computers. ARM architecture is also what has taken over mobile devices, so phones, tablets, those sorts of things. And just to touch on it, boil it down, the big difference between the two is the instructions that land on the CPU to tell it to go do work. And all software, no matter what language it's written in, gets down to instructions that the CPU can understand. And so x86 has its own instruction set, and ARM has a completely different instruction set. And that's why your x86 software is incompatible with your ARM processors, and your ARM compiled software is incompatible with your x86 processors. They don't speak the same language. But Ryan, what about Apple? Apple built a special piece of software to translate between the two. That's how they brought their new processors to market. We're going to ignore that. All right. So they're incompatible. If you look at the TDP of Apple computers, they are generally lower than x86 machines. There are two reasons for this. One, the CPU, the way that it's built, is really a system on chip. They're using very advanced manufacturing techniques to get very small packed components together. One of the things that generates heat is the need to move electricity through a system, because there are resistance in all wires. If you shorten those wires, you have less resistance. You generate slightly less heat over the course of thousands and thousands of transistors and all the other components that sit on a CPU. This can add up to a lot of savings if you can make these architectures very small. That's why you see the race to 4 nanometer, 3 nanometer. Now we're approaching 2 nanometer manufacturing techniques, because it dissipates less heat. Our TDP comes down. We need less power. We're dissipating less heat. It's just better for everyone. And we can run at higher clock speeds with less heat and less power. Then the other thing to keep in mind is when you look at TDP and it is lower, the reason for that is because the Apple ARM processors and the processors in your phones and tablets run at a much lower clock speed, comparable to the high-end x86 processors. And the reason for that is ARM is just a more efficient instruction set. When you send an instruction into an ARM processor, what it actually is doing to get an output is less than a similar or like instruction for x86. x86 is very inefficient. It takes more clock cycles to complete that instruction to get an output than an ARM-based instruction. And so in order to get a like-for-like comparison in performance, on the x86 side, we need more cycles per second. We're just going to need more cycles per second. And if we need more cycles per second to get the same performance, that's why you're going to see higher clocks, even though we haven't achieved any more performance than a comparable ARM chip running at a lower clock speed. It just has to do with the complexity of instruction sets. All right. So that is our options. And from a TDP, again, let's target a range of 35 to 85. All right, as part of that when we look at our options here. I got into a conversation, which was a great conversation, and they said, well, Raspberry Pi has a TDP of 15. Why don't we shoot for that? And as we saw, or I can go back to TinyPad here, one of the things that we're chasing is really fast I/O and new memory architectures. We're not going to get that from a SBC and a Raspberry Pi. And we're also going to run into quite a bit of software compatibility. And one of the things that x86 architectures have going for them is compatibility. And compatibility because an x86 motherboard, when you've chosen DDR4, DDR5 RAM, all those RAM modules are going to work. When you plug in your NVMe drive, if it has a modern NVMe chipset on it, it's going to work. Your SSDs, even down to the CPU socket itself, allows you to pop in and out new CPUs as long as they conform to a chipset that is common within x86 architecture. And Intel publishes their chipsets and has evolutions of those. AMD publishes their chipsets. And so it becomes a very modular, upgradable platform. Unlike ARM, which ARM is only the instruction set. There is no real commonality between ARM platforms for the I/O. So there's all sorts of different memory architectures and how the CPU gets access to those memory, different architectures for disk, for buses. Now, most will support common disk formats like NVMe, USB, those sorts of things. But again, compatibility is a big problem in ARM. Doesn't mean we can't use it, okay? If we know what software we're running and we've got a performance metric that we're targeting and we can find an ARM SBC or an ARM platform that supports all of that, go build it. You're going to get good performance based upon your targets, right? As long as you stay within your targets, it'll be narrow, but you'll get there. And you'll have lower TDP, lower power consumption, which is a great benefit. But we're going to experiment here. And so we need bigger compatibility. And so we're going to use x86, okay? And I know some of you are screaming, well, what about Apple? Even though I said we're not going to use it. I will show you where Apple, real quick here, where Apple has a huge advantage right now. So this is sort of the architecture of a M chip, an Apple Silicon chip. And we've got our CPU and our disk and our GPU, and there's a neural processor right on the chip for doing AI work and other things. And we've got a memory controller here on the chip and hanging on the chip itself, right? So we're connected here. This is all one big die, right? One big chip, if you will, that goes right on the motherboard is our RAM. And so there are lanes directly on the die between our CPU and our GPU towards RAM. And one advantage of that is huge memory lanes. The M4 Max chip can do 546 gigabytes a second of RAM access. Additionally, in normal architectures where you've got a dedicated GPU with its dedicated VRAM, video memory, what happens is the CPU tells the GPU, hey, I've got data for you that you need to process, and it's got to go pull it out of RAM and load it into its VRAM, and when it's done processing it, it pushes it back from its VRAM into the normal system RAM, and it tells the CPU, okay, I've processed it, and here's the output, and all of that just creates latency in the system. Well, one of the advantage of the unified memory architecture that Mac has is there's none of that double dipping and moving big chunks of data around just so you can process it on the GPU, because the CPU can access all the same memory regions as the GPU and the NPU. So it just leaves the data in place and it tells the GPU, I need you to go process this data. Here's the location of it. It processes it. It tells the CPU, this is where I put the output. CPU goes and reads it, and everybody's happy and everything moves around. And it is a huge performance advantage, okay? However, most of what we do, not an advantage for us, and won't really be an advantage to us until we get deep into the experimentation. But when you look at the performance and see the magazines and all of the hype around, oh, the silicon, Apple Silicon is so much faster and is beating Intel. Well, memory architecture is actually one of those reasons, beyond a couple others, right? So let's talk about the laptop CPU problem. So if I look at the specs, I'm like, hey, Ryan, I found this great laptop. It's got low TDP. It sits within our 3 to 5 gigahertz range that we want on the CPU. Yes, that's true. However, we think about thermal dissipation, when we think about heat dissipation, we're not going to beat physics. And one of the things that we want is space for large heat sinks, for fans, and that's going to give us the best chance to stay within those boost clocks. And laptops are just space constrained, right? They just don't have the space for big heat sinks, and they've got tons of tricks they can use. But for what we're going to do, I'm not going to use a laptop because I know I will get thermal throttled. I want the best chance of being able to stay up at those boost clocks. Okay, so we're not going to use a laptop. All right, so I was looking around trying to find sort of what is the modern equivalent. Where can we have some fun and do some experimentation and not have to buy a Mac, right? And so we can have the most flexibility, but also not build some big behemoth machine that is going to suck a bunch of power out of our house for no reason when it's sitting idle. However, we're going to use a mobile processor. So one of the things that came out this last year was AMD announced their Strix Halo architecture. S-T-R-I-X, Strix Halo. It's a mobile processor, but we're going to get into why we're going to use it and why it's not going to act, or at least I suspect it's not going to act like a mobile processor. All right, so the architecture has a TDP of 55 watts, right sort of in the middle of where we want it to be. It's got high clock speeds. So the processor that we're going to use from AMD is called the Ryzen AI 395 Max Plus. The 395 Max Plus has a base clock speed of 3 gigahertz, and it can top just over about 5 gigahertz. So right in line with a lot of the, just above mid-tier processors, but with a TDP of 55 watts, which is really good. The other thing that it has going for it, which I'm excited to test out and see what we can get out of it, because I think this will give us a huge advantage, is it has very fast RAM. So it's using LPDDR5X at 8 gigahertz, and it's in a soldered on quad channel configuration, which gives us 256 gigabytes of RAM bandwidth. So if we go back, that's about half of what the top Apple processors are doing by soldering directly onto the SoC, directly onto the CPU die. This is not soldered directly to the die, it's soldered to the motherboard, but we start to approach those advantages that Apple gave us in an x86 platform with this Ryzen AI processor architecture. But we're completely in uncharted territory here. I did a bit of research trying to figure out, of all the really intensive source software that I have used in the past, if anybody has done this before, and no, they have not. So let's take a look at a AMD AI processor build from a company that I'm excited to introduce you to. If you have not been introduced to this company before, this is a company called Framework. So Framework has been around for a little while, and they are known for modular laptops. Laptops that you can buy once and they are meant to be upgraded. You can swap out the screens, the motherboard, the I/O. And this past year, they have introduced the Framework's desktop. All right. And it is tiny, as you can see the banana fly by for scale. It is a small machine because it's using one of these AMD Ryzen AI processors. And the short of it is, we are going to look at this Max Plus 395 processor. Again, RAM is soldered on the board, so we need to pre-choose the amount of RAM we want. 64 gig is our sweet spot. And it covers the 3 gigahertz base clocks we're looking for. It covers the boost, and we've got a good amount of 64 megabytes of L3 cache. Now, as we move down through the pictures here, you'll see that there's some fun tiles that we can play with on the front. We'll get into that during our build. And again, it is a tiny form factor. So we can stash this thing anywhere, or we can take it with us, move it around. And I do plan on doing that. I do plan on shipping this out, the entire digital front end, to others to critique and take a listen to, because ultimately it needs to sound good, not just to my ears, but we need to make sure that my bias isn't coming into play here. So one of you lucky people may get to hear this thing at some point. All right, and yes, we do have to put it together. It comes in a kit, and we'll show the ordering process on what we buy. It all comes in a box, and we get to put it together. There's also the frameworks expansion cards. So if we want additional I/O on the front, we can buy expansion cards, USB-C, USB-A. There's an SD card. We'll look at that as well. But let's look at this graphic really quick. Because this is a desktop, obviously we've got all of the normal desktop I/O, including this 5 gigabit Ethernet port, which is great. Completely satisfies the 1 gigabit full duplex requirement. And I want to dive into the specs just a little bit more. So let's look at the full specs. And again, we've got that 3 gigahertz base clock, 5.1 gigahertz boost clocks. And one of the things I want to point out here and talk about is this processor power level. So this is the TDP of the system as built. One of the interesting things about this processor is it has different power profiles that you can set up. And at the low end of that is about 35 watt TDP, and at the high end is 120 watt TDP. Okay. Framework sells this at the high end. It is pre-configured for that 120 watt high end. AMD advertises it as 55, which is sort of that mid-tier TDP. We're going to play with this a little bit. We're going to leave it alone at 120 watts when we receive it and see how it performs and what we can do with it. But we'll start playing with these power profiles and see if we can bring that down. Now, the great part about this system is that it idles at about 10 watts. Okay? Again, 10 watts, that's down in the Raspberry Pi territory. And so when we're not using it, since again, we're going to leave it on 24/7, when we're not using the system, it's just going to go into idle mode and it'll just sit there at 10 watts, which is great. That is super efficient. In fact, it's more efficient than most of the desktops out there. So we're getting desktop power. We're using a little more in its standard configuration than our target, but we'll see what we can do by modifying some of those power profiles once we get into more testing. Now, a couple different fan options. The fan differences here are really the acoustical noise, so how much noise these are making. We're going to shoot for the lowest noise fan we can, and we'll talk about placement of this thing because this is not passively cooled. And the reason it's not passively cooled, so let's talk about that for a second. When you passively cool a machine, the expectation is that that cooler, that heat sink, can dissipate that heat, but if you don't give it a chance to relax or you don't reduce the CPU demand, then that heat sink can saturate. And it's using convection, so just the heat sort of moves some air around, and that helps. But ultimately, any passively cooled machine at a sustained load will saturate the heatsink. And when that happens, the only thing the CPU can do is throttle. And it'll thermal throttle to its lowest base clocks, trying to allow the thermal design to catch up. With a fan, you don't have that problem because you're constantly blowing fresh air across the heatsink, giving it a chance to dissipate that heat and cool itself down, which allows the CPU to sink more heat back into that heatsink. And it's just a more efficient way of cooling than passive cooling. And so you don't, unless you're in a really hot room and the ambient air temperature is significantly close to where your CPU temperature is, the fan moves enough air through the system that we should not expect a thermal throttle, but we're going to test it. So that's why we want something with a fan. All right, let's see how much this thing costs. All right, so we're going to check the box here for our Max Plus 395, 64 gig. Looking at storage, right? We need to load an operating system on this thing. We need to load some software. We need at least one drive. There's two options, the SN7100 or the SN850, or you can bring your own if you're into that. I'm going to build the entire system from parts from framework. So we're going to make sure we have enough parts out of the box to put this thing together. The difference here is that the SN850 is a little bit faster, but as we talked about, disk speed is not as important on a source as some of the other components. So if you want to save some money, go with the SN7100. Because I'm going to be doing a bunch of experimentation, loading operating systems, loading software, I'm going to get through that process a little bit faster. So I'm going to splurge for the SN850. We can add a second storage device, and I'm going to add the exact same thing because what I'm going to show you during our build is the ability to mirror and provide some resiliency between these two drives in case one of them fails. Our system doesn't completely fall over. And so that's why I want two of the exact same drives in my build. Operating system, none. We're going to bring our own. We're gonna again go into some uncharted territory and play with a couple different loads of software and see what we can do with this thing. All right, we want that Noctua fan, the quieter one. Power cable. I love that Frameworks allows you to not order a e-waste power cable and just leave it off the build list. I'm going to add one because, like I said, I want this thing to be ready to go out of the box. Side panel. They offer a translucent side panel if you want to see what's going on inside. I'm going to save a little bit of money and not get the translucent side panel, but you go ahead and get it if you want to see the insides. Tiles. Now we can pick and choose our colors. There's a lot here, and this little configurator, you have to fill out the front panel. And tiles, I'm just going to do a real quick selection here. And they even have a couple different logoed tiles. So if you want to put tucks on the front or show that you're, an AMD fan, go ahead and add one of the custom logo tiles. They also have a file that allows you to build your own tile on a 3D printer. So we'll do that eventually. All right, so now we've got some expansion slots that we need to fill, or completely optional. I'm going to fill it with a USB-C and a USB-A just to give me both ports on the front of the machine. And then since we're doing video here, I've got a lot of micro SD cards. It would be really nice to be able to plug one of those in the front. And again, because these are modular, you can swap them in and out as needed. If you prefer SD card or you want an extra Ethernet port, again, it's just really nice to pop these things in and out. These are storage expansion slots we don't need. And a desktop handle, yes, let's put a handle on this thing. All right, let's go ahead and add this. And, oh, wait a minute. Expansion cards. What is going on here? Color options. All right, that's right. The USB-C expansion card comes in a ton of colors. Let's go ahead and get a translucent black one. All right. Now we should be able to add this. There we go. So our total for this build comes out to about $2,200. And that includes an estimated tax. So if we throw the tax away, because this is going to be different depending on where you are, we've got about a $2,000 machine here. Not too bad for the amount of CPU power we think we're buying, but again, we're going to be testing all of this. So for $2,000, let's go see what we can do with it. So I'm going to click checkout here, and I'm going to get this thing ordered, and we will go ahead and sit back and wait for it to arrive. What's that? I think it's here. Let's go take a look at it.